At The Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
This episode of the Nocturnist Conversations is sponsored by Mental Health and Quilt. Mental Health provides support and guidance to individuals, family members, and friends facing short-term health issues or managing a serious illness. Learn more at mentalhealth.com. That's METTLE health.com. Quilt is on a mission to give every family caregiver the skills and support they deserve, starting with expert-led on-demand video classes. Quilt is recruiting founding experts from fields like geriatrics and palliative care now. Visit quiltcanhelp.com to learn more. The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association and the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. I'm Emily Silverman, and you're listening to the Nocturnist Conversations. Today, I am thrilled to be hosting filmmaker Kirsten Johnson. Kirsten is a documentary filmmaker who's worked as a cinematographer on over 40 films in over 80 countries. She's also a documentary film director, most well known for her film Camera Person, which captures the relationship between her and the subjects she filmed during all her years working behind the camera. Her second documentary, Dick Johnson is Dead, premiered in 2020 at the Sundance Film Festival, where it received a special award for innovation in nonfiction storytelling. It's a film that's dedicated to her father and explores the topics of aging, dementia, and mortality. Before I talk to Kirsten, let's listen to a brief excerpt from her film, Dick Johnson is Dead.
My dad had been living alone and going to work and to church faithfully ever since my mom died. My brother and I were both thousands of miles away, and despite what we'd already been through with Mom's Alzheimer's, we didn't notice anything until it was almost too late. We started getting calls from his friends, then his secretary. He was double booking his patients, making mistakes on their prescriptions. He had driven his car at high speed through a construction site and then kept going, 5 miles home, on 4 flat tires. Every call felt like an alarm bell. And even though we should have understood perfectly, we just couldn't bear to hear it again.
Thank you so much for being here, Kirsten.
Hi, so delighted to be here.
So we're really excited to have you here. I was reading that the idea for this project came to you in a dream. So is that true?
Oh, yes, it is. It is totally true. Yes, I had a dream in which I saw a man I didn't recognize in a casket. And he sat up all of a sudden and he said, "I'm Dick Johnson and I'm not dead yet." And, you know, Dick Johnson's my dad. I've made this film with him called Dick Johnson is Dead that's currently streaming on Netflix so people can watch it. And I love that people can watch it all around the world. And he and I had already been through an experience with my mother's Alzheimer's. But when I had the dream, I think my father's dementia had already begun and I didn't yet recognize it. Basically, the dream functioned as a wake-up call for me.
And so was that the natural response was, my dad isn't getting any younger, how do I help him? And then turning to film as the way of moving through that, since film had already been such a big part of your life?
Yes. So I made a film called Camera Person in 2016. And Camera Person is in some ways a memoir, but basically I went back into footage that I had shot on behalf of other filmmakers, and I reordered it and looked at it as a whole in relation to what I had experienced as a camera person behind the camera. And much of what I've filmed over time has been related to questions of social injustice, questions of violence, and having filmed in the aftermath of 5 different genocides in 5 places around the world, having filmed in over 86 countries, I have heard and witnessed a lot of human trauma, not unlike doctors and caregivers, or people who encounter other humans at moments of crises in their lives at scale. And I had sort of reached this point where I couldn't continue filming. I had sort of filmed too much and hadn't processed hardly any of it. So Camera Person was this attempt to engage with all of the ethical questions I had about documentary camera work. But it's a very serious film. It's a very sober and serious film. There's probably one laugh in the whole movie. And it was very well received critically. And it's a very experimental film. I don't speak in it really. It's just the footage itself. And you learn to know me through seeing the footage that I have filmed. And the experience of making it liberated me in all these ways. It sort of made me feel free about how I could work with cinematic language to engage with the questions that are the most meaningful to me. So I'm going deep into this because I feel like this is shared territory. I feel like a doctor or a caregiver's life, there are always these really high stakes. You're always faced by the ethics of how you engage with the people that you're caring for or treating. And you're always being faced by your own lack of control. Even though you have all of this knowledge and experience and incredible, huge sort of institutions that support you and back you, you're still sort of face to face with these impossible situations. And then you do that over and over and over again, and you're left with all those feelings that you don't necessarily have time to engage with. So all of that to say that I had been through a lot with my mother's dementia. And when my brain gave me the wake-up call that maybe my dad had dementia too, again, that I was going to have to go through this again, I had this very strong reaction, I think, which was, I must do something differently or I won't be able to bear this. And so part of that was like, I'm going to deal with this with humor. We are going to defy death. We're going to mock it. We're going to laugh at it. So, the idea was I'm going to make this film in which we work with stunt people and kill my father over and over again until he really dies for real. I was going to be really irreverent about death. Well, it turns out I needed to be really irreverent about dementia and death.
I love this analogy between the documentary filmmaker going out into the world and bearing witness to trauma at mass scale and the doctor or the caregiver going into a hospital and bearing witness to trauma at mass scale. And I love what you say about the decision to pivot from the serious and sober work of art towards something more humorous. And I want to get to that in a bit. But before we do, your father was also a doctor. Tell us about his doctor life.
So my family is generationally Seventh-day Adventist. And Seventh-day Adventism is a religion that was founded towards the end of the 19th century. And from the beginning of its founding, it was really interested in healthcare and medicine and healthy living. So if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, you're hoping to be a doctor or a nurse or a caregiver or a teacher or a missionary. And those are the professions. And my father's father, Elmer Johnson, came from a, working poor family who didn't have money. And Elmer realized he wanted to be a doctor, but the family couldn't afford it. And so he worked all of his life as a gardener, as a, sort of manual laborer with the lost wish of being a doctor. And his first child was a girl, and she became a nurse. This was early when it was hard for women to become doctors. And then my father was born 12 years later. And apparently he was going to be a doctor from birth. It was sort of like he was going to embody my grandfather's impossible wish to become a doctor. And one of the interesting fun facts that you learn about my dad in the film is that he was born with no toes. And we don't know why this happened. We believe it might have been some medication that my grandmother took when she was pregnant, but it's never been verified. And so he was sort of this miracle baby who was born, 12 years after the first child. And he was a boy, and he was missing his toes, and he was going to be a doctor. But when my dad did go to the Adventist medical school that he went to, I think he knew he didn't have any choice about being a doctor. So it was just a given in his life. But I think in some ways he was drawn towards psychiatry because it was a different way of being a doctor. And I mean, he's told me amazing stories. Like at the time in medical school, one of the doctors said to him, you know, there are two kinds of doctors that aren't really doctors and are the most contemptible, and that's abortionists and psychiatrists. But my dad loved talking to people. And the other thing that's hilarious is my dad wanted to sit down. After doing really long rotations, his feet hurt. And psychiatry was the one specialization where he could really count on being able to sit down all the time. So I think it was the furthest from being a doctor, and it was the most comfortable, were the big determinants in his choice. But he loved psychiatry. And he, I think, always had questions and doubts about his capacity to, quote, heal mental illness. But he said, if anything might heal, it will be the relationship that heals. That there is repair work that can be done in a relationship that can be trusted and counted on.
I wanted to touch on what you said earlier about really wanting to come at this topic with humor and irreverence. And you stage his death multiple times, but they're not really medical deaths. It's not like, you know, having a pneumonia or going in and dying of sepsis or all of these ways that people with dementia tend to actually die. But there are these accidental deaths, like the air conditioner falling and spurting blood and things like that. Could you just speak a little bit more to that? Like, why was it so important for you to make this playful?
So one, I mean, you're helping me clarify this and see this. They needed to be sudden deaths. I think because Dad and I are so familiar with the gradual death. We had watched my mother dying for 7 years, and we knew that dementia was going to do that to him too. So I think the thing that's really fun about this experience and this process for me is allowing the contradictions of my feelings. And I am deeply grateful for every moment I had with my mother. And I'm also, you know, just like wildly angry at dementia and Alzheimer's for like stripping her away from us. And it was excruciating. It was brutal. It went on and on. It was relentless. So I think there's some crazy wish fulfillment in like, just like, let it be sudden. Let's get this over with. But on a certain level, like I have made so many different films about poverty, racism, genocide, sexual violence, all kinds of deeply serious subjects I really care about. But I know people don't want to take their medicine. Nobody wants to see it. It's too painful. It's too hard. It's too shameful in some ways. Like, we're still dealing with racism in this country. Like, to acknowledge that is shameful. So there's a way in which, with this film, I was like, why would anybody want to watch a movie about dementia? Like, what kind of, you know, masochist are you? And so part of it was like, to come up with this idea of killing my dad was just like, it was so in your face. It's so absurd. It's so wrong that it's sort of right in a way that Jackass or Harold and Maude or Monty Python is. So that was part of my motivation. But I think also I needed to find some way for us to laugh at this, but also like doing the deaths meant that my deepest fear that he will die, that he will disappear from me, I could keep facing it and then like having it not be true. So that I have his funeral and get to hug him afterwards. He dies and I get to pick him up and we get to laugh about it. That's what you don't get to do in life. I didn't get to hug my mom after her funeral. I think movies can hold a lot. They can hold a surprising amount. And that's what I find so exciting about how long it takes to make them and the way that you make and remake them in the edit room, and they sort of teach you to make them. It was remarkable, this idea of the sudden death or the gradual death, the slow fade away. Without even trying, that idea starts to resonate throughout the film. For some reason, in this observational documentary footage I have of my family, people are always turning the lights on and off, and this sort of light switch of life going on or off. We found it in the footage in all these different places. My mom does it from some very old footage where she has Alzheimer's. My little children do it. My dad does it. But then we had this sort of problem we had to solve with the film where, we had done a fake funeral for my dad. My original idea was that I wanted to have him in an open casket at the front of the church while we were doing this fake funeral. Well, I told that idea to my father. He laughed. He loved it. Told it to my brother, and my brother said, "Over my dead body, you are not doing that." And but then that constraint, I tried to make this film with respect for my father, like respecting his agency, even despite the fact that he had dementia, to draw upon my 55 years of knowing him and his sense of humor, etc. But I also, there are other people whose opinions and perspective matter, and one of those is my brother. And I'm not going to make this film in contradiction to my brother's needs and wishes. And so I had to respect my brother when he said, "You can't do that." But then that gave us this cool solution, which was the day before we did the funeral in the church space, we brought an open casket, we lit it in the same way, we put my dad in it, and we filmed lots of different takes with him. And then later, we used green screen technology and we cut that casket into the scene. Well, the wonderful editor I worked with, Nels Bangerter, was just obsessed with, he needed audiences to know that trickery. He wanted that to not be a question that people were left asking at the end, like, was he really there? Was he not there? So he had to do something with that casket, but he couldn't figure it out. And then it's sort of at the 11th hour, at the very, very, very end of the film, we were trying to figure out that scene and cutting it. And all of a sudden, Nels came up with this situation where suddenly the casket is up there in the front of the room, but then it sort of starts to fritz a little bit, and then it just fades away, and the space is empty. And I saw it, and I was like, Nels, our metaphor about death, does it flicker, go out suddenly, or does it fade away? And he was like, it hadn't even occurred to him. But we had been sort of trafficking in this metaphor in all of these different ways throughout the film. And then he just did it with this image. So you experience it as a viewer. And that's what I love about cinema, is that you sort of bring these thoughts and ideas to it, but then it finds magical, emotional ways to express them.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the fantasy scenes because they're so fun. And what it made me think of as a physician is palliative care is a new field. Everybody needs palliative care, and often it's introduced late into the course of people's illness. And when the palliative care team finally arrives and they sit down with the patient, some of the first questions that they ask are, in your remaining years, what are your goals? What are your hopes? What are your dreams? If I could wave a magic wand for you, what would you wish for? These are questions that the medical team almost never asks. Like somebody might say, well, I really want to go to Disney World with my grandchild. And suddenly all of the care is oriented around that one goal and everything just makes sense. Whereas before it was more scattered. Or somebody might say, my goal is to go back to Mexico and die in Mexico. And nobody would have known that if not asked. And so these questions that you ask him, like, if you could have one wish, what would it be? And he says, to have toes. And then you're able to make that happen for him through these fantasy scenes. I guess I'm wondering, like, it just reminded me a lot of the healthcare profession trying to do that wish fulfillment for people before they die. And is that the lens through which you were viewing that, or is that what you were trying to do?
I think this movie is wish fulfillment for me. My wish was for my father's immortality. I wish that my father never die. So I put all of this effort into making something cinematically meaningful. And also, I've gathered all this evidence of who he was. But I think we often sort of don't allow our self-wishes because when you say them, you're also acknowledging fears or the potential of loss. And what's interesting with a camera, bringing the camera into a situation, in some ways is bringing loss into a situation. Because a camera brings the future into the room. It brings death into the room. We are going to create these images together, but at some point in time, we who animate these images will no longer be alive, but the images will be here, and this will be what remains of you. Buster Keaton was dead long before I met him in cinema, but he's incredibly alive in cinema. So you all bring death into the room, you caregivers and doctors, as much as you're trying to bring health and life and healing into the room and medicine into the room, right? Your presence brings death into the room, and it brings fear of loss into the room. I do the same thing as a documentary camera person.
You talked about when the caregiver comes into the room or the healthcare worker comes into the room, the tone shifts and that signals something and that symbolizes something. And one thing I noticed about this film is how little you medicalized him and how little the dementia was medicalized. There was really only one scene that took place in a medical setting. And I was laughing so hard. I was rewatching it last night, where there's that woman and she does the test and she asked him, here are 5 words. I'm going to distract you and then I'm going to ask you to recall them. And he can only recall one of the words. And then the next shot, it's like her back and she's typing into a computer. And I was just like hooting because it's so emblematic of what healthcare has become. And so I'm wondering, was that intentional that you wanted to keep this story out of the medical setting and really keep it more in the home?
I had all kinds of dreams and wishes about where this movie was going to go. And Dad and I did a trip to Portugal during the course of it. And we ended up meeting this man who was a skin doctor who had this incredible office that was like from the 1930s. His father had been a doctor and then he'd inherited it. And he had this amazing lithograph on his wall of people being unzipped from their skins and wanting new skins to be in. And I was just obsessed with the idea of bringing my dad to this doctor and having him read the story of my father's skin. And I tried so hard in my faltering Portuguese and then with a translator to get this doctor to be willing to film this scene. Because I was just like, this would be so amazing. And he wouldn't do it. He felt that it was unethical to film the scene with my father and that it wasn't what he did as a dermatologist, actually, to be a sort of fortune teller about skin. But in my mind, I wanted this scene so badly. I sort of wanted another doctor's take on my dad, like a deep psychological take on him. I'm not denying that that's complicated. Is it okay that I'm making a film with my father while he has dementia? A comedic film? That's a really real question. Is that okay? I think about what's special about my dad. When my kids were first born, he came, I have twins, and they were born prematurely. He came the first week, and the way he talked to them was so hilarious, so respectful, just like they were full human beings. It was just like this revelation, wow, he's done that for me my entire life. But it reminded me of how he dealt with my mother with her Alzheimer's. He understood she had a disease, but he also understood she was a brilliant person and the person he loved. Somehow he managed to not be patronizing to her, not medicalize her. And I think unconsciously, almost, that's sort of where I was coming from with my dad, is like, I want to respect him. Even if he's asked me the same question like 500 times today, I'm going to answer it, or I'm going to be playful with it, but I'm just going to try to stay in the zone of respecting him on his terms in the present moment.
Yeah, and I think as a society, we're not very good at respecting our elders, at respecting people with cognitive impairment. I mean, I think part of the whole COVID pandemic was that it was affecting older populations, and just the way that our society responded to that or didn't respond to that, and the way that we view old people as not useful or not lovable or expendable, and how sad that is, and how in medicine, the geriatrics community is really trying to shape a different narrative around our elders. And there was a moment in your film that really reminded me of this, which was when Dick goes to visit Lolita, his crush, and they're flirting with each other, and he makes a joke about wanting to see her without her clothes on, and she jokes about her sagging, and then he says, actually, the wrinkles make it better because you have twice the surface area.
Classic. Quite the come-on joke.
And it was such a great example of how, people when they're old, like, they still have a sense of humor and they still have their sexuality. I guess I don't really have a question about that, just a comment that I wanted to share. And then the other piece of that was in the scenes with you and your kids and your father, just the really beautiful moments of family. And in dementia, we talk a lot about the things that we lose and the things get stripped away. But I was wondering, what do you and your kids gain by living with someone with dementia?
Well, both of your questions are around valuing people, right? And I so echo you, and I hear you about what we did at the beginning of this pandemic and what we're still doing. That there's so much out there around who's expendable, who we don't want to see, whose suffering we don't want to see, whose physicality we don't want to see. And, I think this on societal levels, whenever things are being hidden, pay attention. And whenever people are being hidden, right? People are being hidden in prison. People are being hidden in hospitals. I'm just always of the mind of like, pay attention to what we're hiding. And I think that is, Arthur Miller said about like, that's the work of art, to reveal what is deliberately being hidden. I think this pandemic has revealed much to us about how interdependent we are and how quick we are to imagine each other expendable. But, those of us who are close to a person, whatever age they are, and we love them, it is devastating. Their loss is devastating. But all of that is swirling around in this moment at scale. And I think we go back to that term, right? Like, this is unprecedented in human history. Not that there's a global pandemic, but that we all know about it, that we can see images of it, that we can all count the numbers together, that we can see nations reshape the story of what's happening, that we can watch nations engage in different experiments about how to approach it, see nations fail and nations succeed around the approaches, and then have it all flip again. It's totally unprecedented. The only thing for me that's familiar in some ways is the nature of the grief. Like, I do think it has parallels with when you have an extended death, like happens with a degenerative disease, you have extended grief. You have anticipatory grief. And I think we are all engaged in forms of anticipatory grief during this pandemic.
At the very beginning of the film, you say, now it's upon us, the beginning of his disappearance, and we're not accepting it. And then we have Marta, the caregiver, who has accompanied 10 different people in the last 30 years in their end-of-life experience. She says, if you accept it, it's easier. And so I'm wondering, do you think that the experience of making this film will make it easier to accept the loss of your dad when that happens?
No way. Nope, I don't stand a chance. I think I'm going to be steamrollered anyway. I'm sitting here teary just because you're speaking about Marta. And get this, my dad went into a dementia care facility in August. And he is now there and being very well taken care of and is comfortable, though, like ready to come back and live with me or my brother, like in a heartbeat. But it is no longer possible. Well, Marta went on from working with my dad to work with a couple who are 101 and 97. Through a long and complicated story, and not Marta's fault, they got COVID. They both recovered from COVID. Marta has been in the hospital for the last 4 weeks at age 53, fighting for her life. The great news is that she just got released from intensive care, and we believe she's going to be fine, knock on wood. But this is the craziness of life and death and healthcare, right? Like that we have young healthcare workers who are dying before the people they're taking care of. Can you make it up that the 101-year-old and the 97-year-old both got COVID and were fine, and Marta's been wiped out? And I just think about Marta saying, you just got to accept it. Well, none of us were accepting the idea that Marta might die. When I learned that Marta was in the hospital, I was like, no, this is not happening. I cannot accept this. And I think it's easier for a caregiver to say, we've got to accept that a 97-year-old person is going to die than the daughter of that 97-year-old person. And I think there are some people for each of us, and it might just be ourselves, right? I can't accept that I'm going to die. Or I can't accept that my mom's going to die. And I think that is human. I think once we get just a little bit out from it, we're like, oh, okay, it's acceptable. It's natural that people die. But if you are a lifetime entangled with a person or you just fell in love with someone, no, you are not accepting that they're going to die. No way. And I'm still not accepting that my dad's going to die. Even though I've practiced it a bunch of times. And even though I am helped and comforted by the fact that we have this movie and that he will stay alive in this movie for my children in the future, that his ineffable spirit is available to other people, that I don't have to try and explain what that was, that I don't have to explain why I'm so sad to lose it. It's like, look at this magical person. I don't want to lose this magical person.
He is a magical person. I mean, even just like his smile and his laugh and his sweetness, like it really comes through even for those of us who have never met him in real life. And same with Marta. I mean, it was a very short scene with her.
Isn't she extraordinary?
I fell in love with her.
Right. And you're devastated by the idea that she might be sick with COVID, right?
Maybe I'll leave you with one last question. I really love the scene with Mike, who was helping take down the shelves in your dad's office. And you say to Mike, we all carry our parents in us. What do you carry from your dad? Now, I would like to ask that question for you. When Dick Johnson is dead, what will you carry forward from your dad?
I aspire to the way he listens. And I have to say, there's a quality to the way that you are asking questions of me, that you have opened up some spaces and slowed me down. And it reminds me of my dad. It's like you allow the space and the time to think. And I think the fact of being a doctor is to understand a little bit about the deep complexity of what it is to be alive. And that understanding, I think, allows potentially for people to be their fuller selves publicly. So respect to you and respect to my dad. And I hope that I learn to allow more and create more space in relation to other people.
Well, I just want to thank you for making this film. I mean, truly, I've never seen anything like it. And I think for everybody listening, whether you're experiencing somebody in your family with dementia or just as a healthcare worker, this film will really, really open you up. It's just so original. So I think probably should be mandatory viewing for all for all healthcare workers.
Well, nothing would make me happier because I have such gratitude and respect for healthcare workers.
Well, thank you so much, Kirsten.
This has been such a joy.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the Nocturnist Conversations was produced by Head of Story Development, Adelaide Papazolo, and edited and mixed by John Oliver. Our executive producer is Ali Block, our director of operations is Rebecca Groves, and our original music is by Yosef Monroe. The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works tirelessly to make sure the doctor-patient relationship remains at the center of medicine. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. The Nocturnist is also made possible by the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, a group of tech-inspired global changemakers, optimists, and visionaries advancing AI and data solutions to create a thriving, equitable, and sustainable future for all. If you've enjoyed listening, give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. To contribute your voice to one of our upcoming projects or to make a donation to support our work, visit our website at thenocturnist.com. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. See you next time.